candidates know time is running out to sway undecided Iowa voters. Tonight, former President Donald Trump made his case to voters in Sioux Center. The former president focused on personal grievances against prosecutors and touched on both domestic and foreign policies. KTIV's Matt Hoffman takes us there.
Former President Donald Trump took the stage in Sioux Center Friday, pitching a return to his previous administration. The former president said he'll deploy the largest deportation operation in history if he's elected.
Stop the invasion on our southern border and begin the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. We have no choice.
Lynn Evans, a Republican state senator representing 5 Northwest Iowa counties, said he's not worried about a Trump presidency becoming a way to settle old scores.
The majority, his message is moving forward and what he's going to do when he gets in office and how he's going to do that. And I think if you're a part of the establishment, the permanent structure of Washington, D.C., I'd be a little nervous too.
The former president also reacting to the news that the U.S. Supreme Court will hear his appeal to remain on the ballot in Colorado. That news coming down just as the former president stepped on stage here in Sioux Center.
But just as I did before, I'll appoint strong, highly qualified, pro-Constitution Supreme Court justices who will interpret the law as written. And I hope they do that.
Former President Trump will be back in Sioux City on January 13th, just 2 days from the caucuses, which take place January 15th. To view the former president's speech in its entirety, visit our Facebook page. In Sioux Center, with Chief Photographer Acacia Phillips, I'm Matt Hoffman, KTIV News 4.